Las Vegas, February 1973. The lights burned white-hot, 20,000 fans screaming for the king. Cameras flashed, guitars roared, and Elvis Presley stood center stage in his white jumpsuit, smiling like nothing could shake him. But halfway through his biggest hit, he froze. His eyes locked on one face in the crowd, Priscilla, and she was crying. February 10th, 1973, Las Vegas Hilton, Nevada. The stage looked like a sunrise carved in gold. Packed house. Spotlights danced over rhinestones, and the orchestra swelled with the opening chords of C.C. Ryder. The roar of 20,000 voices hit like thunder. Backstage, Joe Esposito gave the signal. He's ready. The curtain rose and Elvis stepped into history. White jumpsuit, blue cape, diamond-studded belt that glimmered brighter than the chandeliers above. The crowd lost its mind. He tilted his head, grinned, and threw the first scarf into the audience. It landed in the hands of a woman who screamed like she'd caught lightning. The king laughed, a sound that used to come easy. But that night something was off. His smile looked right, but it didn't feel real. Even Joe noticed. "You okay, E?" he asked before the show. Elvis just said, "Yeah, man, let's give em a good one." He always gave them a good one, even when he was running on empty. As the band kicked into Burning Love, sweat glistened on his forehead. The stage lights reflected off the jewels on his collar like little stars. He hit every note, but his eyes weren't scanning the crowd like they usually did. They were unfocused, almost searching for something or someone. Then came Suspicious Minds. Every night it was the same set list. But tonight that song hit different. The opening riff echoed through the hall, and something in his posture changed. He gripped the mic tighter. His jaw tensed. When he sang, "We Can't Go On Together," the line cracked slightly. A woman in the third row gasped. She thought it was emotion, but Joe knew that sound. It was the sound of a man breaking from the inside. As Elvis sang on, flashes popped like fireworks. The Hilton stage shimmered in electric blue. Each verse carried weight, each lyric sharper than the last. He poured himself into the song like a confession nobody asked for. Then, just before the bridge, he did something strange. He stopped moving. The band kept going for a beat, then looked to him for a cue. Nothing. He stood still, staring past the spotlights, eyes locked on something or someone, in the front rows. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. A stagehand whispered, "What's he doing?" Joe followed his gaze, and then he saw her, Priscilla Presley, sitting near the front, hands clasped, tears streaking down her face. Elvis's lips parted, but no sound came out. The crowd, not realizing what was happening, started to cheer, thinking it was some dramatic pause. But the band knew. Joe knew. Even the lighting crew froze, because they'd never seen him like this before. He lowered the mic slowly, eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched 5 seconds, maybe more. The energy in the room shifted from electric to fragile. Then he whispered one word, barely audible into the mic, "Scylla." It echoed through the speakers, soft as a prayer. The crowd went still. The orchestra fell silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop humming. For the first time in his career, Elvis Presley wasn't performing. He was remembering. He blinked hard, swallowed, then turned away, gripping the edge of the piano to steady himself. Joe started to step forward, but Elvis raised one hand slightly, a signal. He wanted to keep going. The band waited. The fans waited. He took a slow breath, looked down at the microphone again, and whispered, "Let's do this one right." The orchestra prepared to resume, but no one knew what was coming next. "Would you?" Hours before the lights dimmed in Las Vegas, a woman sat in her car outside the Hilton, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her steady. Priscilla Presley hadn't planned to come. It had been over a year since the divorce. The tabloids called it amicable. The truth? It hurt like hell. For both of them. That morning, she'd received a call from one of Elvis's aides. He asked if you'd be there tonight. Lisa Marie's coming too. She almost said no. But her daughter's voice changed everything. "Please, Mom. Daddy said this one's special. So she came. Quietly. No press. No announcement. Just Priscilla, a simple black dress, and sunglasses she didn't really need. She didn't want to be recognized. She just wanted to see him one last time, maybe. By the time she arrived, the Hilton parking lot was packed. Cameras flashed as fans lined up outside, clutching ticket stubs like golden passes to heaven. Inside, the air buzzed with electricity. Ushers led her to a seat near the front. Row A, seat 7. Close enough to see the stage lights shimmer off the rhinestones on his jumpsuit. She hadn't been that close to him in months. As the orchestra tuned, she caught her reflection in the champagne glass on the table. The same woman who'd once waited backstage, laughing at his jokes, wiping sweat from his forehead between songs. The same woman who'd watched him fall asleep mid-sentence after another show, the guitar still in his hands. Now she was just another face in the crowd. When the curtain lifted, the room erupted. The king had entered. Elvis looked magnificent, larger than life, but human in a way that hurt to watch. His smile was perfect, his movements sharp, his voice filling every corner of the room. Priscilla tried to smile back, but her chest ached. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way he hid exhaustion behind charm. She had seen that look before. In the last months of their marriage, when words stopped working but love hadn't disappeared. During the first few songs, she stayed still, letting the noise wash over her. When he threw scarves into the audience, she remembered how he used to save one just for her. When he sang Love Me Tender, she remembered their wedding dance. His arms around her, whispering, "This one's ours." She hadn't realized tears were falling until they hit her lap. She wiped them away quickly, but the lights caught the movement. Someone nearby noticed. Cameras always found faces like hers. A few fans whispered. One woman nudged her friend, realizing who was sitting just meters from the king. Up on stage, Elvis turned slightly during a bridge, eyes scanning the front rows. At first, it was casual, a performer checking the crowd. But then he stopped, his gaze fixed on her. Priscilla felt it instantly, that electric jolt like being pulled back into a moment that never really ended. His hand faltered mid-gesture. He missed a beat. The drummer hesitated, unsure whether to keep going. The crowd didn't notice. They thought it was part of the act. But she saw the change in his eyes. The performer vanished. The man appeared. She wanted to stand up, to leave before it became too much, but her legs refused to move. When he started Suspicious Minds, she knew this was no longer a show. It was something else. A conversation they were having without words in front of 20,000 people. Every lyric landed like a memory. We can't go on together. He wasn't singing to the audience anymore. He was singing to her. And as his voice cracked on the next line, the tears she'd been holding back finally fell. People around her started to notice. The cameras zoomed in, catching her face in the half-light. One of the band members, glancing toward Elvis, whispered under his breath, "He sees her." That was the moment the king lost his rhythm. His voice dropped. His hand trembled. The song stumbled to a stop. He looked straight at her. Just one heartbeat of connection in the chaos, and everything else disappeared. Have you ever locked eyes with someone who once knew your soul? What would you do if the whole world was watching when it happened? The brass section swelled again, and the crowd roared as if nothing unusual had happened. But Elvis wasn't hearing the music anymore. He was staring straight ahead, past the lights, past the cameras, into the face of the one woman who still knew his truth. Priscilla. He took a step back, just slightly off cue. Joe Esposito noticed from the side curtain and whispered to the stage manager, "Something's wrong." Elvis lifted the mic to his lips, but the words came late. The band adjusted instinctively. Years of training kept the show alive. But inside he was unraveling. He sang the next verse softer, like a prayer no one was supposed to hear. "We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out." Each word was a bruise reopened. He could see her wiping her tears. He wanted to stop the song, to go to her, to say he was sorry. But the spotlight felt like a cage. The crowd clapped to the beat, blissfully unaware they were watching a man fight his own history live on stage. By the second chorus, his hands began to shake. He gripped the mic stand tighter. Sweat ran down his temple, tracing the same path as the lights that danced across his rhinestones. From the front row, Priscilla's lips parted as if she wanted to tell him to stop, but she couldn't. The noise drowned everything. And then it happened. He forgot the next line. For 3 agonizing seconds, the king of rock and roll, the man who'd performed in front of millions, stood frozen. The drummer missed his cue. The horns faded out. The audience went quiet, confused. A single voice from the back yelled, "We love you, Elvis." It broke the silence for a heartbeat, but it wasn't enough to bring him back. He lowered the mic. His breathing was heavy now. Joe moved toward the curtain again, ready to cut the show short, but Elvis raised one trembling hand, signaling no. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He turned slightly toward the band and said, barely audible, "Let it breathe." The pianist Glenn Harden caught on. He played a soft, lingering note, filling the empty space. The rest of the band fell into silence. Elvis closed his eyes, head tilted back, and whispered into the mic, "Scylla." Her name floated through the arena like a secret finally escaping. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously, not sure if they'd heard it right. He opened his eyes again, locking on her one last time. The ache in his chest seemed to melt into something else. Peace, maybe, or surrender. Then, in a voice low and raw, he began singing again. Not Suspicious Minds. Something else. Something unplanned. Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have. The band froze. That wasn't on the set list. But Glenn, still at the piano, followed his lead instinctively. The first notes of Always on My Mind filled the air. The audience gasped again. He'd never sung that song live before. Every lyric was a confession. Every note a scar reopening. His voice cracked halfway through, and instead of hiding it, he let it break. Fans in the back row started crying. The king wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing. Priscilla covered her mouth with her hands, shoulders shaking. She mouthed the words with him. "Maybe I didn't love you." Elvis stopped on the word love. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then, with eyes wet but steady, he looked straight at her and finished. "Quite as often as I could have." The orchestra didn't dare play over it. The spotlight dimmed to a single beam. He stepped away from the mic, chest rising and falling, as if the song had taken something out of him, or given something back. For nearly 5 seconds, no one clapped. No one moved. It was as if 20,000 people collectively held their breath, afraid to break whatever spell had just settled over the room. Then came the sound, slow, hesitant applause that built into a wave. But Elvis didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just nodded once toward her, whispered, "Thank you," and turned his back to the audience. The lights dimmed completely. The concert wasn't over, but in a way, the show everyone came for had already ended. Because the king hadn't just sung to a crowd. He had sung to one soul, and every person in that room could feel it. Have you ever seen someone tell the truth without saying a single word? That's what happened that night, when music became confession, and the crowd watched a legend become human. The echo of his last note still hung in the air when the house lights dimmed to black. For a moment, no one knew what to do. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows applause. It was heavier, reverent, confused, electric. 20,000 people, frozen between tears and disbelief, waiting for the next chord that never came. Elvis stood center stage, eyes still locked on the spot where Priscilla sat. His hands trembled around the microphone, knuckles white against chrome. Behind him, the band waited for a cue that didn't come. The conductor raised a hand, uncertain. "Boss?" he whispered under his breath. Nothing. Elvis lowered the mic to his side, breathing shallowly. The spotlight caught the faint shimmer of sweat rolling down his temple. He looked exhausted but also relieved. Then, with a shaky laugh, he leaned closer to the microphone and whispered a single word. "Scylla." The speakers carried it softly, almost tenderly. People in the front rows gasped. Cameras flashed. Some thought he was joking. Some thought it was part of the show. But those closest to the stage could see his face, the tears in his eyes, the raw vulnerability no act could imitate. He wasn't joking. He wasn't performing. He was speaking from somewhere no fame could protect. A murmur rippled through the audience. Then silence again. The only sound was the faint hum of the amplifiers. Joe Esposito, watching from the wings, felt his stomach drop. He whispered to the stagehand, "Don't move. Let him finish whatever this is." Elvis stared into the lights for a long, unbroken moment. The brightness washed everything out, but he kept looking, as if searching for her through the glare. And then, slowly, he did something no one expected. He sat down, right there on the edge of the stage, legs dangling over the crowd. The audience gasped. No one had ever seen him do that before. The king didn't sit during shows. He held the mic loosely in one hand, the other pressed over his chest as he caught his breath. "You ever love someone so much," he said softly, "that you forget who you were before them?" The words weren't meant for 20,000 people. But 20,000 people heard them anyway. Priscilla's hand rose to her mouth. He nodded faintly, almost to himself, then smiled through the tears. "Guess that's what this song was about all along." The pianist, Glenn Hardin, started to play quietly, just a few gentle notes. Elvis looked over, nodded once. "I'll finish it," he said. But he didn't sing. He hummed, softly, almost like a lullaby. It wasn't the melody of any hit. It was something else. A tune no one recognized, fragile and pure. The arena went absolutely still. You could hear someone crying 3 rows back. Even the ushers stopped moving. Then, as if on cue, the lights began to fade to blue, the universal signal for the end of a show. But no one clapped. They didn't dare. Elvis stood again, slowly. His shoulders straightened. The trembling stopped. He looked at Priscilla one last time. She whispered something. No one could hear it, but he smiled. He turned back to the mic and said quietly, "We're okay now." And just like that, the spell broke. The band picked up the closing riff of Can't Help Falling in Love. The crowd, unsure what to do, began to cheer again. Some clapped, some cried. Elvis sang only half the song. When he reached the line, "Take my hand, take my whole life too," his voice cracked completely. He stepped back, eyes glistening, and let the orchestra finish for him. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was slow, respectful, almost sacred. Joe Esposito rushed forward as the lights came up. "You all right, E?" Elvis nodded faintly. "Yeah," he said, voice breaking. That one was for her. The crowd began chanting his name. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" But he didn't take another bow. He simply waved, whispered, "Good night," and walked off stage, leaving the mic standing alone under the spotlight. Backstage, the crew didn't speak. No one did. They all knew they'd witnessed something rare. Not a performance, but a moment of truth. Elvis sat down in the dressing room, pulled off his cape, and stared into the mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't see the king. He saw the man he used to be. The boy from Tupelo who just wanted to sing, who fell in love and lost his way somewhere between the lights and the loneliness. Joe sat beside him quietly. "You okay, boss?" Elvis smiled weakly. "For the first time in a long while," he said. "Yeah, I think I am." He reached for a pen, grabbed a napkin, and scribbled something quickly before folding it into his pocket. Joe glanced at him. "What's that?" Elvis shrugged. "Just a note. Some words I never said when I should have." He leaned back, exhaled, and closed his eyes. Outside, the crowd was still chanting his name. But he wasn't listening. For him, the show had already ended. And the silence he left behind was louder than any applause. Have you ever watched someone heal in real time and felt like you shouldn't be there to see it? That night, 20,000 people did. Backstage, the corridor pulsed with the sound of muffled applause. Assistants hurried past with headsets and towels, whispering questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Elvis sat motionless in front of his mirror, the rhinestones of his jumpsuit catching the dim yellow bulbs like trapped stars. He could still see her face, Priscilla's tears glinting beneath the lights. Every word he'd sung out there felt unfinished. Joe Esposito hovered by the door. "You sure you're all right?" Elvis nodded, barely. "I just need a minute." A minute turned into 10, then 20. Finally, he stood, straightened his collar, and said quietly, "I'm going back out." Joe blinked. "The show's over." "Not yet." He walked down the hall toward the stage, passing stunned crew members. The crowd was still buzzing, half standing, half unsure if the concert had really ended. Then the house lights dimmed again, and a single spotlight bloomed at center stage. The audience gasped. Elvis reemerged, no cape, no theatrics, just a man and a microphone. The band scrambled to their places, uncertain what was happening. He lifted the mic and said, "Folks, sometimes music says what words can't." A ripple of murmurs swept through the hall. He motioned to Glenn Hardin at the piano. "Let's play the one we never do." Glenn hesitated, then struck the opening chords of Always on My Mind. The crowd fell silent instantly. Everyone in the room knew the story behind that song, but no one expected to hear it tonight. His voice entered softly, shaky at first, then steady, rich, vulnerable. "Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have." Every syllable trembled with regret. His tone carried no performance polish, only truth. Cameras flashed, but no one dared cheer. The air was thick enough to hold. He sang the next verse, looking nowhere except the front row. Each line felt directed at her. Not the fans, not the legend, just Priscilla. "Maybe I didn't love you quite as often as I could have." Her hands covered her mouth. Tears streamed freely now. Behind him, the orchestra swelled gently, strings blending with the slow heartbeat of the drums. It sounded like forgiveness. By the bridge, his eyes were closed, his body still. The lights dimmed to gold. The man who once filled stadiums with swagger now stood bare before his past. "Little things I should have said and done." His voice cracked again, but this time he didn't hide it. He whispered the final line. "You were always on my mind." Then silence. No cymbal crash. No applause yet. Just that echo, soft, eternal, lingering like smoke over velvet seats. For a few endless seconds, even the air didn't move. And then, quietly at first, people began to stand. One by one, like witnesses rising in church. No screaming, no frenzy. Just tears and hands pressed to hearts. Up front, Priscilla rose too. Their eyes met one last time. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." He smiled faintly, nodded, and whispered into the mic. That one was hers. The crowd erupted then. A sound that wasn't just applause, but release. Joe Esposito watched from backstage, eyes wet. He muttered to a sound tech. He finally sang the one he was meant to sing. When Elvis walked off stage, he didn't look triumphant. He looked lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted from his chest. In the hallway, Joe clapped him on the shoulder. "You know they'll talk about this forever, right?" Elvis smiled, quiet and sincere. "Then maybe they'll finally know who I was." He turned once more toward the distant echo of the audience still cheering, then whispered to himself, "That's all I ever wanted." Have you ever seen someone find peace in front of the whole world? That night, 20,000 people did. When the curtain finally dropped, the applause didn't stop. It rolled through the Hilton like thunder, echoing up the marble walls, spilling into the casino floor beyond. People outside who hadn't even been in the show started clapping too. They just felt it. Inside, Elvis walked off stage into a corridor lined with roses and reporters. He waved them off gently. "Not tonight, fellas," he said, voice hoarse. Tonight wasn't for the cameras. He slipped into his dressing room. The lights buzzed softly. He looked at himself in the mirror. Sweat-soaked hair, trembling hands, eyes red but calm. For the first time in years, the reflection staring back didn't feel like a stranger. Joe Esposito came in quietly, holding a towel and a bottle of water. You sure you're all right?" Elvis smiled faintly. "Yeah, I just sang the truth for once." He sat, unbuttoned the top of his jumpsuit, and exhaled slowly. The roar of the crowd still rumbled through the walls. He reached for the napkin he'd folded earlier, the one he'd written on before the encore, and tucked it into his pocket. "I'll keep that one for me," he whispered. Outside, Priscilla left quietly through the side exit. No reporters saw her. The desert wind caught her scarf as she stepped into the night. A fan nearby asked if she'd enjoyed the show. She just smiled through tears and said, "You have no idea." The next morning, headlines exploded. Elvis stops show for emotional moment. Crowd in tears. The king sings to his queen. Radio hosts called it the night the king sang his heart bare. But for Elvis, it wasn't about publicity. He refused interviews, canceled the press junket, and spent the next day in silence. When Joe asked what he wanted for breakfast, he said, "Peace." Over the next weeks, something changed in him. He started skipping the after-parties, showing up to rehearsals early, singing gospel between sets. The Vegas staff whispered that he was different. Softer, quieter, maybe even happier. But the memory of that night followed him everywhere. Fans who had been there wrote letters describing it as a holy moment. Some said they'd never forget how he whispered her name, Scylla, through the microphone. One fan, a young woman from California, later wrote in her diary, "That was the first time I saw a man forgive someone by singing." The story became legend. In later interviews, Priscilla never spoke directly about that night. But when asked what she thought Elvis's greatest performance was, she'd always smile and say, "Vegas, 73. Backstage staff said that after she left, he kept to himself for hours. He asked for pen and paper and wrote a short note, folding it into his jacket. When Joe peeked later, he saw only 3 words. "We're okay now." He never explained what it meant. He didn't have to. That performance became one of the most talked about shows of his entire career. Not because of the music, but because of the silence that followed it. There were no encores. No spectacle. Just one man on stage, finding peace in front of the world. And the world never forgot. Have you ever seen a legend become human, and somehow greater for it? That's what happened in Las Vegas that night. Decades later, people still talk about that night in Las Vegas as if it happened yesterday. The show wasn't filmed. There's no official footage. But those who were there swear they can still hear it. That trembling voice that whispered, "Scylla." It became one of those rare stories that pass quietly from one generation to the next. Not through tabloids, but through hearts. A plaque was placed at the Hilton years later, near the old stage entrance. February 10th, 1973, the night the music stopped. Beneath it, an engraving. He sang not to the crowd, but to the soul. Tour guides tell visitors about the night Elvis stopped mid-song and changed everything. Some think it's legend. Some think it's truth. But everyone who hears it feels the same thing, that maybe greatness isn't about how loud the cheers are, but how deep the silence runs afterward. Priscilla, years later in an interview, was asked about the rumors. She paused for a long time before answering. "I don't think people will ever understand what that moment meant," she said softly. "It wasn't about fame. It was about forgiveness." Her eyes glistened on camera, and for a brief second, she smiled. "He sang to me once, and it healed something I didn't even know was broken." By the 1990s, the Hilton had changed names, and the neon lights had dimmed. But every August, during Elvis Week, fans would still gather near the same spot where the stage once stood. They'd bring flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Some even placed small cassette tapes labeled Vegas 73, the night of silence. A man from Tupelo once left an old ticket stub wrapped in a white handkerchief. The note beneath it said, "I was there. I stopped believing in God that year, until Elvis looked up." Stories like that kept spreading. They weren't about stardom. They were about grace. And maybe that's why the legend never faded. Because the king didn't leave behind a throne. He left behind a truth. In a world obsessed with perfection, he showed that vulnerability is power. That saying, "I'm sorry," even without words, can reach deeper than any song ever could. Years after his passing, sound engineers tried to find a recording of that night. None surfaced, but one audio technician swore he once heard a faint bootleg on an old reel. Barely audible, but real. He said you could hear the band fade, then silence, then a voice whisper, "Scylla, we're okay now." Whether that tape ever existed doesn't even matter, because the story itself became the echo. At Graceland, a small display now holds a simple white scarf and a handwritten lyric sheet titled "Always on My Mind." A small card beneath it reads, February 1973, his song for forgiveness. Visitors stand quietly in front of it, no selfies, no chatter, just silence. That's the real legacy of Elvis Presley. Not just the music, not the sold-out shows or gold records, but the humanity beneath all of it. He reminded the world that even kings have hearts that break, and sometimes it's the breaking that makes them unforgettable. And in that silence, between the music and the memory, something sacred still lingers. If you listen closely, maybe you'll hear it too. Not applause, not guitars, just a quiet voice saying, "We're okay now." If the story moved you, share it with someone who's ever loved and lost. Because some songs aren't meant for charts, they're meant for hearts. Legends may fade, but moments like this never die. And sometimes, the loudest truth comes in silence.